Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. We are slowly transitioning into the Christmas season. I have my Goosebump Krampus shirt on. I'm about to do a lot of redecorating with the back of my bookshelf, get some Christmas foliage up there, and I figured this is a great time to do another Dissecting Gothic Lit episode. As you can tell by the title, we're talking about a not so traditional Gothic Lit story, but a very, very well-known and beloved story. So today we will be talking about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. For some reason you've never read A Christmas Carol, don't worry, this is not the full book. This is 5 Charles Dickens novels in one, but unfortunately this is the only copy of A Christmas Carol that I have in this big old beautiful Barnes & Noble edition. So before I even dive into A Christmas Carol, I just want to talk about the fact that I believe Charles Dickens is a very Gothic writer. He has written multiple Gothic stories. A Christmas Carol is technically a ghost story, and he was a contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe and lived at the height of the Victorian Gothic era. For those of you guys who don't know, this is my favorite fact about Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens had a pet raven. If you go and visit his house in London, which I have, if I can find the photo, I will insert it as I'm talking about this. But Charles Dickens had a pet raven, and Edgar Allan Poe went and hung out with Charles Dickens one day and met this raven, and then all of a sudden had this incredible idea to write the Raven story. So if it wasn't for Charles Dickens and his good old pet, there would be no Raven poem, and I think that is amazing. But it's not just that Charles Dickens was friends with Poe that he wrote some Gothic stories. We can also look at some of the other Gothic short stories that Dickens has written that are lesser known than Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities, Bleak House, etc. If you've read Bleak House, though, that novel's bleak. Bleak for a reason. So I have 2 of my beloved Wordsworth editions of Gothic collected short stories. I've talked about this before on my channel. I love these editions. So this is Gothic short stories, and if we open it up, right after Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe, we have Charles Dickens' story, A Madman's Manuscript, which was written in 1836. Also included in this book are J.S. Le Fanu, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Elizabeth Gaskell, Robert Louis Stevenson, Ambrose Bierce, M.R. James, a lot of the big names in Gothic Lit. And then in classic Victorian and Edwardian ghost stories, we have 2 Charles Dickens stories this time. We have the story of the Bagman's Uncle, and then To Be Taken with a Grain of Salt. And again, he is among the names of Edgar Allan Poe, Elizabeth Gaskell, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, Wilkie Collins, Robert Louis Stevenson, Oscar Wilde, and the list goes on. So I think it's very safe to say that not only was Charles Dickens a contemporary of Gothic Lit, but he also was a writer of Gothic Lit, though a lot of his Gothic stories tended to be more on the short side, which is why A Christmas Carol is also technically considered a novella instead of a novel. And probably, I could be wrong on this, but I believe the shortest, book that he wrote. It's very, very, very brief. I think it's 100 pages long. I have not actually read the text of A Christmas Carol since I definitely read it in middle school, and I think I reread it in high school at some point. But it's a story I'm very, very familiar with. I've watched all of the adaptations before. My personal favorite is Scrooge with Albert Finney. If you've never seen that, it's a very dark, brooding, very Gothic musical version of A Christmas Carol, and I actually feel like is probably the closest to the actual story that you can still holds up in today's cinema. But let's talk about A Christmas Carol. So A Christmas Carol was originally released in 1843. It was not serialized as a lot of Charles Dickens stuff was, and it was released with illustrations by John Leech. I will try and put some photos up of John Leech's illustrations because they're absolutely beautiful, and my copy doesn't have them. And you've definitely seen these illustrations before. They're very, very famous and very, very beautiful. And the original title was actually A Christmas Carol in Prose, Being a Ghost Story for Christmas. And I think one of the crucial things that we have to remember about A Christmas Carol is that when this novel came out, Christmas was still kind of a scary holiday. Christmas was very much about sitting around a fire and telling ghost stories with your family, and wasn't so much about Santa Claus leaving Christmas presents under a tree. In fact, the year that Charles Dickens wrote this, 1843, I believe was right at the height of popularity of Christmas trees being introduced to the UK. I know that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had both pretty much taken the tradition of the Christmas tree and very much popularized it in Britain. Around this time too, the concept of Christmas cards started circulating around the UK as well, and it became very much a like more jovial holiday, more family and like fun oriented holiday. And being right on the cusp, I think, is why Charles Dickens was able to write a ghost story and have it literally stand the test of time of being this very classic Christmas tale that's also quite terrifying when you sit and really think about it. So I'm not really going to dive into fully dissecting the plot of A Christmas Carol. I think you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who has never heard the story of A Christmas Carol. It is extremely famous, and if you're not interested in reading the book, you can pretty much find any kind of film adaptation from here to there, and you will have all different interpretations of the story. But the core root of A Christmas Carol is that the miserly businessman, Ebenezer Scrooge, he's a moneylender, is so greedy and so driven by money and finances that he's kind of alienated himself in life and found nothing but money and greed to be his sole driving factor. So he is visited by 4 ghosts in one night to kind of get him to change his way. And he is visited by the ghost of his former business partner, Jacob Marley, who died 7 years before and is coming to warn Scrooge of the fate and hell that he will endure in the afterlife if he doesn't change his ways. And then the ghost of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas yet to come. Another thing that I think makes A Christmas Carol so Gothic, apart from the actual focus of ghosts, is kind of the message that Charles Dickens was sending. He was very upset about the way that children in poor working class families were treated and being raised and surviving in his time, in his day and age. And a lot of A Christmas Carol is really focused on bringing the mass population's attention to how children in the working class and the poor poor families survived. This is why we not only have such a huge focus on Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim. I think everybody really knows who Tiny Tim is. But more importantly, I want to talk about a scene that is actually taken out of most film adaptations, and that is when Scrooge is with the ghost of Christmas present, and he is always kind of depicted as like this like grand Yule king or a holly king, very jovial and like over the top. But under his big robes, he has 2 emaciated, starving, dirty, like very tragic looking children. And they are known as Want and Ignorance. And they are, to me at least, they've always been the scariest depictions in films, and I found them very disturbing in the story as well. And when when Scrooge is faced with them head on, that is when Scrooge feels the need to kind of ask the ghost of Christmas present, like, if there's something he could do to help, or who are they, or what's wrong with them. He shows some kind of concern, which he doesn't show at any other point in the story up until this point. And he believes that they are the children of the ghost of Christmas present, and he's like, no, these are mans. These are ignorance and want. These are like the fruits of humans' inability to basically care for the poor and care for the upbringing of children. And it's a very bleak and disturbing image that you see of this rich man and this very well-to-do ghost and these 2 just emaciated, starving children in front of them. And that was definitely something that Charles Dickens really wanted to drive home when he wrote this story. And I do actually think it's kind of a shame that it's the one scene that I feel is always taken out of major motion pictures. It's definitely not in Scrooge. It's not in most adaptations that I can think of. I think off the top of my head, I can think of like 1 adaptation where I've seen it before, maybe 2 if I like really dig back into the past. But luckily, Tiny Tim, his character, which is a little more optimistic, has become a very, very influential character in pop culture. So Dickens definitely was able to get at least that point across, that Bob Cratchit deserved more than he was being paid on his low minimum wages, where he was probably not even going to get Christmas off to support his family and his very sick child. Now, apart from the obvious of Scrooge being visited by 4 different ghosts, to kind of, you know, lean into the Gothic tradition, 2 of which are quite scary. I would definitely say that the Christmas yet to come ghost and Jacob Marley with all of his change are very, very disturbing images. Again, Christmas present, he's very, very jovial. Depending on the interpretation of the Christmas past ghost, she can be very pretty. I know she's got like that like light thing that you can like snuff her out like a candle, which happens in the story, but you don't really see that in film adaptations. Which is actually, like, as I'm rambling, kind of leads me to focus on the fact that a lot of these adaptations have taken a lot of the horror out of the original Christmas Carol. The book is way scarier than most of the film adaptations, which really lean into that jovial Christmas side that we focus on so much in modern times. But the original story was still on that kind of Gothic, depressing, scary side of Christmas that I really, really love and adore. So the novel is definitely scarier than many of the adaptations would make it seem. Just to kind of continue on how this novel is still very heavily a part of the Gothic tradition. Usually when you see Gothic stories, a manor or some big architectural structure is at the center point of the story. Whereas with Scrooge, we instead get his entire past life and the life that he could have as our basic character. We have the Scrooge that we are interacting with, who is visiting with the ghost, and then he is watching basically his past life unfold before him, almost as if it was a movie. And that right there is where the core of the narrative takes place and where our sprawling architecture is, where instead of being in a building, we are pretty much in the mind and inner workings of Ebenezer Scrooge, which I think is a really interesting take on the Gothic setting. Again, we are also focusing on the sanity of our character. Is Scrooge actually seeing these ghosts? Are they real? Is this a dream? Is it his consciousness? We don't really know. I love to think that the ghosts are real, but hey, I return to the Screw as if the ghosts are real. So again, we get kind of that question of, is any of this even happening, or is he really just having kind of a psychotic breakdown? And I think that ambiguity, which is more accepted that the ghosts are real than that he's having his like mental breakdown, but I do think that that ambiguity is there, and again, very much in line with our Gothic tradition. We also do see kind of a redemption story. Not necessarily that that is a huge part of the Gothic tradition, but kind of a story arc of the unraveling or undoing of a character based on the presence of spirits, be them good or malevolent. I feel like that's very rooted in the Gothic tradition, and we do definitely see a full unraveling of Scrooge's character from the beginning of the book when we get to see him fully changed at the end. You kind of see that very strongly with Rebecca as well. In the story of Rebecca, our main character is kind of this meek, timid girl who grows up to be this very self-sufficient, independent woman by the end, based on all of the circumstances that happen with the memory of Rebecca, and kind of how that memory is affecting her as she's going through her new life at Manderley. And then, of course, another large tradition in the Gothic is kind of like the nighttime journey. This entire story is very much rooted in the nighttime story. The whole thing takes place over one night, even though we do get a glimpse into the entire life of our main character. A lot of this story is based on Scrooge's own fear and the element of fear and how it is used against him, and fear of his past mistakes, coupled with how those mistakes will lead into the fear of the future that he doesn't want. And again, just this kind of psychological undoing of our main character. And I think a lot of people don't realize this, but one of my favorite tropes in the Gothic tradition is the frame story. The Scarlet Letter uses it very well. The Turn of the Screw uses this very significantly, but A Christmas Carol is kind of a frame story, because we have literally Scrooge, like, on Christmas Eve, kind of being an asshole, goes to sleep. The entire story unfurls in his sleep, or in his, like, bed chambers, and then we leave the bedchamber to get the conclusion of the frame story of how he has now taken what happened to him that night and that whole unraveling, and now puts it back towards how he's going to interact on Christmas Day. And while it's not a true traditional frame story, the structure is definitely there. And at the end of the day, it teaches a lesson. There's a huge moral lesson of like compassion and sharing the wealth and avoiding greed and whatnot. But again, it is the building up of an individual character that I think is so strong and so important in the Gothic tradition with A Christmas Carol. We see that with characters like Mina Harker, we see that with characters like Frankenstein's monster, we see that with characters like the main female protagonist in Rebecca. It is very much a core root of a Gothic story, at least I feel. You see it again with like Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is probably the best example of this, of growing into like being a better person and learning a lesson about life. And I just think that this story, even though again, very Christmassy, very much rooted in like the holiday happy spirit, is still at the end of the day a very dark, scary, and very, very Gothic story. So yes, if you've never read A Christmas Carol, Dickens is not my favorite writer by any means, but I do think it is very interesting to read the text of A Christmas Carol and compare it to what we see today in modern films. I think you will be very surprised at how dark the original story is compared to what we have nowadays. It is one of my favorite traditions every single year to go and rewatch Scrooge. If you've never seen it, I believe it came out in 1971. Again, it stars Albert Finney. It is so fantastic, and I don't think you can watch that film and step away from it and not believe that A Christmas Carol is 100% a Gothic story. Anyways, that is all that I have for you guys today. As always, I post every Monday, Thursday, and sometimes on Saturdays. If you enjoy these videos, please hit the like and subscribe buttons down below. And welcome to Christmas season, guys. I'm so excited that it is here. And we can do the Krampus thing, we can do the holiday Yule thing, we can do the ghost thing, and of course, just Christmas in general. I do love Christmas time. Halloween's still my favorite holiday, but I'm a big Christmas person as well. Anyways, thank you guys so much, and I will catch you all in the next one. Mwah.